huge number of individuals and organizations in the audience who are either involved in these issues from the advocacy and those who have come in contact with the criminal justice system, organizations on campus like the Criminal Justice Awareness Association of the campus-wide. So we're looking for you, as well as the judges and other lawyers in the audience. How many lawyers do we have here? Okay, so we have enough lawyers to have a little session right here to join us, and we're going to ask you to join us along with the panel. Okay, so without further ado, let me give you a brief introduction. Hopefully you picked up the biography forms that are at the outside of the auditorium. But briefly, to my left is Daryl Atkinson, who is a second chance fellow for the U.S. Department of Justice, and he also serves as senior staff attorney for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice here in Durham, of course on leave now as a second chance fellow. To the left of Daryl is Maurice Greer. Maurice is co-president of the student organization here on campus calling B.4, Building Bonds and Breaking Bars. And before each of them speaks this evening, I'm going to ask them to say a little piece about what they do. And to my far left is James Williams, of course, a good friend of the Stone Center and public defender for Orange and Chatham County here in North Carolina. So let me just briefly ask Daryl if you say a little bit about your work, and if you will, to say a little bit about how what you do is reflected in this particular film.
Sure. So I'm Daryl Atkinson. I'm the inaugural Second Chance Fellow at the U.S. Department of Justice. But I got to be candid. I didn't one day wake up and say I wanted to work for the largest law enforcement agency in the country. My life history kind of propelled me in that direction, and let me kind of give my disclaimer. None of my comments can be attributed to the administration, neither the outgoing or the incoming. With that being said, you know, my trajectory in this work really started in 1996. When I was convicted of a first-time nonviolent drug crime and sentenced to 10 years in prison in the Alabama Department of Corrections. On that 10-year sentence, I served a mandatory 40 months for that drug crime. I went into prison with a high school diploma, came out with a high school diploma. Fortunate enough for me, I had a loving family that could provide me food, clothing, and shelter, and I was able to piece my life back together. Went back and got my education, my law degree. I'm licensed to practice law in Minnesota and North Carolina. Developed a practice area at the Southern Coalition, exclusively focused initially on the restoration of the civil and human rights of people who have been in contact with the criminal justice system. And as far as, you know, representation and reflection in the film, I mean, it's everywhere. You talk about the process of re-entering and all of the barriers that people face because of contact with the system. Even though I'm barred in 2 different states, I still can't vote in the state of Alabama because I was convicted of a crime that they designated as a crime of moral turpitude. So these issues are up close and personal for me, and it's why I do what I do.
Good afternoon, my name is Maurice Greer, as Dr. Jordan said. And I'd first like to acknowledge my co-president, William Barlow. Will, if you just raise your hand. A lot of things that B.4 does, I would not be able to take part in or nearly get it done or accomplished alone, and so I appreciate your support, man. With that being said, B.4, Building Bonds, Breaking Bars, Barriers Against Reaching Success, we mentor at-risk youth. And youth within juvenile detention centers in the Durham area currently, and we're seeking to expand, and so does CJAA, the campus-wide group. Originally, the group was founded on mentoring minority men, because, as the film is stating, it's very historical practice for minority men to be targeted, Black men specifically. And why I do what I do, I come from a community that is about 99.9% Black, and oftentimes I am the anomaly. You know, success is the outlier, coming to college and those things is not something that many people in my position have the privilege to do. And so it's my duty to be able to pay that back and to help students get out of that revolving door for oftentimes minor offenses, but stealing a pack of gum or having, weed, cannabis, which can be a major offense to some, but it's not something that's uncommon in other areas or social circles, if you understand my drift. So, with that being said, it's my duty to make sure that my people and, at first my people are able to succeed and have a way to progress, and then everyone, because it is about spreading love. Thank you.
My name is James Williams, as was indicated, and I want to go back to the phrase, my duty. That is just so critical when we look at where we are in this country and the challenges that are confronting us and trying to achieve the promise that was the founding basis of this country. And one reason I do what I do is because I grew up before entering high school involved in the civil rights movement. And I know the value and the importance of that struggle and that effort. And I know what was accomplished as a result of that struggle and that sacrifice and that effort. And I see every day that those rights and privileges that were gained through the loss of blood and life are being stripped away by a criminal justice system run amok. And I'm a public defender, and some of my colleagues are in this room. Raise your hands, please. Former public defenders too. Raise your hands, and the reason I do that is because I think it is so critical that if we are going to address this problem, that public defenders have to be a critical part of that effort. I think just by the work we do every day, we are a part. But I think we have to be a more organized part of dismantling this structure of mass incarceration. So I guess in a brief nutshell, that's why I do what I do. And, yeah.
Can we stay with you? I'm interested in one of the questions that Ava DuVernay has asked us to direct to some of the panel members is, do you end up almost immediately talking to your clients about race will affect them in the courtroom or in the system?
Well, no. I mean, the short answer is no, I don't. And each case, each client situation has to be addressed based upon the particular circumstances of that case and that client. Now, there are situations where you do need to address race, and sometimes I don't have to raise it. Sometimes it's raised by the client. So you do need to be prepared to have that conversation. And it's an excellent question, because one of the things that I think as defense attorneys, not just public defenders, but defense attorneys, sometimes because we are, our day-to-day activities are attempting to humanize and protect the rights of indigent clients. If you are a public defender, most of whom are people of color, you can sometimes succumb to the belief that race is not really a factor for you, because this is the population that you are out here struggling to help, struggling to represent, struggling to defend. And so part of the challenge is, and this gets into this whole question of, different types of racism and how it impacts what we do. So we talk about implicit bias, unconscious racism, and how decision-making can be impacted by race, even though you're not necessarily aware of it. And that's an important, I think, aspect of all criminal justice stakeholders, that we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to make sure that when we are making decisions, when we are interacting with our clients, when we are making decisions about whether this plea offer is a reasonable plea offer, is this a case that I should take to trial, whether I need to seek more resources to help me properly defend this client, we need to make sure that we are not making decisions unconsciously that negatively impact clients of color based upon unconscious bias or racism.
Maurice, I do want to come back to you in a second, but I want to go to Daryl. So.
Thank you, Miriam.
I do want to get into this question of reentry, because I know that's one of the areas of work that's very important to you, about how difficult it is for individuals who are coming out of the system, and even in your own instance where the idea of voting and being able to have a basic right of citizenship has been removed. How has that work progressed for you here in Durham or in the North Carolina area?
So just, I think the film provided some good context that there are over...
The person who's leaning on the wall, you're leaning on the light wall. Don't touch it, don't touch it, don't touch it, please. All right, I'm sorry.
I thought the film did a good job of providing some overview about the number of these legal barriers, over 45,000 according to the American Bar Association. I will note that North Carolina developed a similar catalog first called CCAT that really set the model for the eventual ABA tool, but these tools do a good job of aggregating all of these what's called civil disabilities in one place. And so in my personal circumstances, my driver's license was automatically suspended because of my drug crime. I was denied federal financial student aid to pursue post-secondary education. But they're also informal as well, practiced by custom and, attended to the social stigma that comes with having a record. So I was denied admittance into a four-year institution and several law schools because of my criminal record history. So when folks who have records face all of these categorical exclusion in every domain of life, and then you look at that population and it's highly racialized, that's where the analysis around a new Jim Crow comes into place, because folks, because of disproportionate contact with the criminal justice system, now that population is highly racialized. And then you have all of these legal restrictions that prohibit them from employment, housing, education. You've effectively created an apartheid regime, so to speak. So a lot of my work has focused both at the local, state, and federal level on removing those barriers and creating opportunity for people with records. It can be anything from ban the box at a city or county level to, at the federal level, really encouraging our Department of Housing and Urban Development to, buttress their guidance under the Fair Housing Act. Oh, so it's removing or delaying questions about criminal record history until later on in the process. The EEOC put out guidance saying that to categorically exclude people with records at the front end of the employment process is a violation, or could be a violation, of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act because of the disparate impact that it can have on African Americans and Latinos and other protected classes. The same thing applies in the housing arena under the Fair Housing Act. And under the Obama administration and under the leadership of former Attorney General Eric Holder that created the Federal Interagency Reentry Council, government, at least at the federal level, has been working in a collaborative way to try to come up with solutions to relieve these barriers.
I'm going to ask one other question, and then I'm going to turn over to the audience because I know you've been waiting. Maurice, I know that B4 and CJAA have a series of kind of things that they're trying to do. And I know that your focus on pre-adjudicating youth is an ongoing part of your work. Is there anything else that you all are engaged in that kind of touches on what was spoken about in the film? Any upcoming work as young people trying to do this? One of the things I want to mention is that B4 was organized by 4 or 5 young men here on campus because they were concerned that young people who were in a pre-adjudication status were missing school and did not have opportunities to keep up with their classwork. So these young men would organize students on campus, go out to the places where they were incarcerated and tutor them so that they would be able to keep up with their classes when they were released. So I'm very impressed.
So I appreciate that, Dr. Jordan. So recently, I guess just to give a little background, B4 had to revitalize for certain things. The center that we used to visit was closed down and the students were dispersed across the state. And that was CA Youth Dillon Center. And that being a major problem because of staffing and funding and different things like that, largely goes into the problem of why prisons are privatized and how we could see that possibly spilling over into the juvenile center. So that's not something that we've delved into yet right now. Our main concern is the students that are currently there. And so we've developed a curriculum and different ways to engage them and prepare them for when they're released from that center, so that they can be placed on like an academic track, so that they don't continuously loop themselves into this revolving door of crime. Because oftentimes, as the film was saying, if you've always been labeled a criminal, if you've always been looked at that way, perceived that way, then that's what you're going to be. And so it's teaching them that they are more, that they can be more. It's embedding a culture of there is another way, and I can do it without resulting in getting arrested for something petty like stealing a rotisserie chicken out of Food Line. Some of you may laugh, but that's the reality for a lot of people. You don't have food at home, you don't have bread, you don't have these things, and so what do? And that's the reality that a lot of the people, the peers that I grew up with, lived in. So with these students at the Durham County Youth Home that we will be mentoring this semester, we're seeking to teach them about financial literacy and navigating this world of having to put on a suit, having to change the way that you speak, saying yes sir and no sir without actually saying sir, and just knowing the ins and outs of the world that we live in. So, and bringing them to campus because they are not oftentimes allowed to go outside.
One of the ideas is to give them an opportunity in the same way that Daryl is a graduate of Benedict and St. Thomas School of Law. And I know that campus experience was important for your determining what you wanted to do and then returning back to try to work to deal with some of the issues in the criminal justice system. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the microphone over to you with one plea. And the plea is that you are brief so that we can get as many people in. And if you're not brief, I'm going to try to step in and urge you along. So please raise your hand and I'm going to pass the mic to you. And you can address your question to anyone in the panel, any individual member or to the panel as a whole. Questions? Okay, I'll start here and then I'll come back to you.
Mike Chatham. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us. This question is directed basically at all three of you gentlemen. So, Mr. Williams, you talked about your time in the civil rights movement. You also said that you've seen the justice system run amok, if you will. I'm so sorry about your name, gentlemen. Mr. Grier? Mr. Grier, you talked about working with at-risk youth and how important it is. I'm so sorry. Mr. Atkinson, you talked about receiving a second chance after being in the system. My question to you all, and I think what many of us are also interested related to the film talks about history, specifically how slavery has brought us to this point in a very powerful way. And I think that's a conversation that we're not having at all. And I'm certainly not asking you to give us an anthology of the history of slavery. That's not what I'm asking at all. What I would like us to perhaps focus on is this idea that maybe it's not that there's a few bad apples running amok. Maybe it's the system that we're living in that is requiring, you know, the next slavery, if you will, which slavery we know became Jim Crow, became the war on drugs, became mass incarceration, and with the people that are coming to power now, God knows what's next. But what I would like you all to address is, when are we going to address the fact that maybe the system was actually designed to be this way? It was designed so that youth were at risk. It was designed so gentlemen spend more time in prisons and less time in classrooms. Perhaps that is the structure, and that's what we need to be talking about. Thank you.
Well,
One more question.
Mike?
The movie touched on the inability to make bond or pretrial release as coercing pleas and leading to wrongful convictions. And as a concrete solution, I'm interested in your thoughts on how important it is to have a racially neutral, empirically based pretrial risk assessment tool and eliminating cash bond in our criminal justice system.
Well, let me begin with this thought. I think such a tool, if it indeed exists, and when I say if, because racially neutral, then it could be helpful. But I think, from my perspective, if we really want to address, and it is a significant issue because too many people stay in jail unnecessarily because they don't have money, and that should not be the case. So from my perspective, doing away with money bail is the preferred solution. And I know that there might not be the political appetite or will to do that now. And so sort of a stopgap solution, this tool, I think, would be useful if it indeed is racially neutral. And also if you have some other, some areas have, pretrial release programs, things of that nature. So I think there are a combination of things that can help address the pretrial release issue. And the tool certainly is one of those. I don't know if anybody else.
yeah, with regards to risk assessments, and in any of these interventions, I think we need to rest in the fact that there is no silver bullet. We got to do a lot of stuff, so from first contact and de-escalation and community policing all the way to the adjudicative function and properly funding public defense and creating metrics and systems of accountability for prosecutors to conditions of confinement to the back end of the system. So we got to do a lot of stuff, right? With regards specifically to risk assessments, I would encourage folks who are interrogating that particular intervention to ensure that you have a good mix of dynamic and static factors, because if your risk assessment tool is heavily weighted towards static factors, for example, my criminal history is not going to change. Dynamic factors are things that can change. So for example, if I have a substance abuse class, or I've taken anger management, or if my home ties in the community are more fortified than they once were, those are indicators that can shift. Therefore, some of those racial disparities aren't baked into your very tool, and what you are trying to achieve could potentially be more fruitful. With regards to the gentleman's question about really addressing what is animating, what mass incarceration, and when I think of it, it's really a symptom of a deeper American sickness. Structural racism that works in service of white supremacy, uber capitalism that is a system of disadvantage that preys on that, and patriarchy. And those are kind of the animating forces behind it, and they're forces that we've been grappling with for a long time. I think convening such as this and films such as this that are raising consciousness and helping people interrogate the real issues are our first step.
Other questions? I'll come here. While I'm walking back, and then I'll come over to you. I want to mention, you notice that there are 3 men on the stage, and that was not what we planned. Individuals that we had asked to participate. Many of you know Ava DuVernay. She had planned to come, but yesterday told her she wasn't able to make it. So recognize that we have sensibility about that, please.
Thank you. I guess this question is mostly directed to Mr. Williams. I wanted to ask you about a phenomenon that's gotten a good amount of attention in recent years, and that has to do with the costs imposed on people who are trapped and entangled into the criminal justice system. So a couple of years ago, the Center on Community Alternatives published a report on finding the family. There have been a few other articles and news reports about the way in which people who are exposed or in any way involved in the criminal justice system are taxed, fined, at the beginning, at the middle, at the end stages, such that their debt load it has created such a burden on them and on their families and their communities. So it's another way in which people are completely trapped within the criminal justice system. We also know that the public defender system is so under-resourced, and yet some of the funds that support public defender systems come from those very fines. So it's another way in which it seems like we're pitted against each other in terms of the consequences of the failure to properly fund a public defender system. And I asked this question of you, not to put you on the spot, maybe more as a comment, because I don't think many people realize the way in which our state legislature, like so many others, refuse to give any shred of credibility to the notion of right to counsel in criminal matters by not funding public defender systems. But it's a conflict, and I wonder what you might suggest we, those of us who can still vote, might do to help resolve that.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think it is a problem that we use the term excessive cost and fees. One could also look upon it as the extraction of wealth from indigent people. Most of the people that I represent are indigent, and by definition, they are poor, but yet, if they are convicted of an offense under North Carolina law, if they were appointed a public defender, not only do they have to pay a certain amount of attorney's fees, but there's a $50 appointment fee. I think it's still $50. These things change over time just for having a public defender appointed. And this is on top of a number of other types of fees. If you have to stay in jail, there's a jail fee, there's a fee for this, there's a fee for that. Some fees are waivable, some are not. a lot of the money that's being raised by the court system goes to other places other than the courts. So it is a significant problem. You know, people are familiar with Ferguson, and they think that and Ferguson was a serious problem related to cost and fees. And North Carolina's cost and fees problem is a bit different than that, but it still amounts to a system that forces or attempts to force money from poor people using a criminal justice apparatus. But I would sort of differ with your framing of the problem slightly, because it's not just indigent defense that is not properly funded or adequately funded. I mean, I think the criminal justice system in total is, but we certainly could use additional resources to properly represent the clients that we represent, and that is a part, you know, I think you're right in looking at, and I don't know whether they discussed it in the film or not, they may have mentioned it, but inadequate legal defense is one of the contributing factors to this whole mass incarceration piece. But then when you think about it, if you downsize the system, if we, there's a talk about going back 50%, cutting back 50%, if we had 50% fewer people, if we went to an incarceration rate of where we were in the 1970s or 80s, then from a financial standpoint, you know, in terms of the cases coming through the system, you wouldn't need this huge outlay of money that people are complaining about now. But how we, you know, the question of how we address the cost and fees issue, there's some efforts underway right now, both community groups and some advocacy groups. One of the problems, I think, is that the legislature has made it even difficult for judges to waive fees, because judges have to now, by law, the legislature has forced them to sort of give account of how many fees they waive. So at the end of the year, there's a tally. And I don't know that, I think the impact of that could be that some judges who were properly waiving fees because they knew that people could not afford to pay may feel pressured now to assess those fees. And when you load those fees on the back of people who are indigent, you are almost ensuring further contact with the criminal justice system, because when they can't pay, there's usually some sort of order for arrest or show cause order to come into court, and you might end up back in jail. So that cycle just continues. So I think the public really needs to be aware, and they need to let their elected officials, not just legislators, but prosecutors, judges, and others know that this is an issue of concern to you as a citizen. And that's one way to begin to help.
We had a question on the side. What would you do? Question. Okay, and I'm going to give it to you. Let me ask very quickly, not to put anyone on the spot, are there any judges in the audience? There we go. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Destiny Talley, and
Destiny, you have to stand.
Okay. My name is Destiny Talley, and I'm very attuned to the power of words. And in the documentary, and as well as the new Jim Crow, they talk about how we define blackness. And during slavery times, blacks were seen as property. During the Jim Crow era, blacks were seen as second-class citizens, and now they're seen as criminals. So my question is more so, how do we associate the definition of blackness with a more positive connotation?
Hey, so that was a good question, Destiny. So In my opinion, I think that starts with us, right? It starts with how we use language and dialect. For anyone who doesn't know, just like the basic fundamentals of, let's say the Webster's Dictionary, there are people that decide, okay, this word is in common use throughout this community and we're going to add it, and this is the definition based off of, the people in this area. So it's all determined about culture. It's like how we use and how we brand ourselves, right? That goes to our music, that goes to our slang, and I can say this because I'm black, we say, that's my nigga. And what we don't realize oftentimes, and this is something that often causes a rift between you and say the person next to you, is that you could be using it as a term of endearment. But at home, I can't say that word. My mama will smack me in the face if I say that word. And it's solely because she understands the historical context from which it came. So if we're continuously branding ourselves nigga, and that's what we were called as a way to demean us and to dehumanize us, then we're just recycling that process. I understand I understand the reclaiming and those kinds of things, but if you understand the power of words, then that word has already been defined. So how about we just find a new one, That's just, that's my 2 cents.
One thing that I think we need to give some thought to, because, that this whole process of the criminalization and criminalization and condemnation of blackness is something that's been centuries in the making. And there are various forms of media that has perpetuated that. And so until we can begin to have some influence and actually use sort of economic capital, whatever means we have, to force media to stop perpetuating these images and these connections to black people, particularly black men, and criminality and dangerousness, then it will continue, because it's on this repeat cycle, and it gets into your DNA whether you realize it or not. And so trying to figure out some way, and I know that there are media organizations that are very sensitive to this issue and that are trying to address it. But for the most part, the mainstream media, could give a damn. I mean, they just continue. So, I mean, I think as citizens, and this is where we have to be what I call democracy activists, because, this is getting to the question of what can you do? I mean, I know what I can do in terms of trying to address this, but it's not going to change until, ordinary people who are not connected or involved in the criminal justice system become concerned and figure out what avenue, what leverage they can use to become a part of this effort. Because there's not going to be any significant change until we have something approaching some type of movement. Whether it's declared as a formal movement or not, it's going to have to involve, numbers of people that are sitting on the sidelines right now. And they may be sitting on the sidelines because they don't know what to do. So one thing that you can do is to be more cognizant of the media issue and think about avenues that you can take to try to help change that and connect with some of the entities that are pushing that issue forward.
If I could wax real quick on the question, and I really appreciate it, because I think it implicates something that I deeply believe, that you have to shift culture. If you shift culture, law and policy follows. And the issue of language, and I want to concretize it in something that we all can take and do, irrespective of our particular station in life. So if you're a student in your scholarship, if you're a faculty member in your writing, if you are someone in the courtroom, purge the word offender, ex-offender, ex-felon, ex-convict. Purge those words from your language, because I'm more than that. I'm more than the sum total of one choice in 1996. I'm a father, I'm a lawyer, I'm a deacon in my church, I was honored at the White House, I fly around with the freaking Attorney General, right? So I'm more than just a single moment in time. So what should we call you, Daryl? I'm so glad you asked. How about people? People who've been to prison and jail, people who are in contact with the criminal justice system, people in prison, people returning from prison. But the operative word is people because it centers the humanity of our fellow citizens.
Hey there. So the film talked about ALEC and how private corporations have a lot of direct influence on the legislative process and how the prison industrial complex benefits monetarily from high incarceration rates. And I was wondering if any of you, and this question may not apply, but if any of you have had a personal experience with a law that you know to be related to ALEC.
A law? Yeah. Well, ALEC has been involved in the passage of several laws here in North Carolina. I think most legislative sessions were the past 5-6 years. There's probably been some law that ALEC pushed, but when you say involved with, I'm not exactly sure what you
mean. Your personal experience or any clients that you dealt with?
Well, yeah, they've been involved in voting laws. They've been involved in pushing gun laws here in the state of North Carolina. North Carolina's own version of, Stand Your Ground. I think ALEC was initially involved in that effort. So they're busy. They might have lost a little bit of their ammunition because they've been so disclosed now, but they're still operating.
So Daryl, ALEC is very important, but I wanted to go back. Let's do that. I wanted to go back, maybe people isn't powerful enough. How about Black citizen? Every time. Or citizen. Because the idea of citizen has so many rights.
I'm gonna, if that's what you choose to use instead of ex-convict or ex-felon, that's fine. I'm sticking with people because, I'm not just a civil rights activist. I'm a human rights activist, and it centers that humanity, and that's kind of the frame that I operate from. But I appreciate you having the imagination to think of something different, and I think that's what we all have to do, and probably most importantly is it's more accurate, right? So similar, and people in the formerly incarcerated community, this was really the genesis of this kind of language movement really came about from Eddie Ellis, a formerly incarcerated man in New York. But we can borrow praxis from the undocumented community with the I campaign. And they got the Associated Press to quit using the word illegal because illegal describes conduct, not people. Similarly, if you apply this to the criminal justice context, similarly, ex-felon, ex-convict, ex-offender, those words describe conduct that might have occurred that broke the social compact, right? That resulted in me being convicted of a crime. It doesn't describe the person. So I think if you are, even as a scholar, you should strive towards using descriptors that are the most accurate and put things in the best context, in the most accurate context.
Good evening. My name is Charity. I have a question regarding what are your thoughts on tactics for mobilizing the community around these topics, like mass incarceration in the prison industrial complex. And I ask that because we're a room full of college students, college grads, professionals, but a lot of these issues don't necessarily impact us directly. So what are your thoughts on making sure people understand the actual policies that are impacting their communities? Because it's very dense. They're very dense policies, very dense vocabulary that I don't understand, and I'm in college, and that doesn't mean that someone in college couldn't, but it's not easily accessed sometimes. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I can start with that. I'm primarily I'm a lawyer by profession, and lawyers don't necessarily make the best activists, but because we're not trained for that. But I do have an interest. I believe that both as a lawyer and as a criminal justice stakeholder, we have a duty, we have an obligation, probably more so than the average citizen, to do whatever we can do to help correct this system, to help dismantle this system. I think I've said that before. And so there are different ways that one can do that. And one way that I utilize here locally is trying to do events just like this. I've found that documentaries, there's some excellent ones, are excellent tools or platforms for bringing people together, for informing, and then having discussions about what, like we're doing right now, what can be done, what role can I play to try to address this. So that's one avenue. Another is trying to make sure that people turn out and participate in events where issues are being discussed and policies being made. That happens almost every week somewhere in this county, whether it's the school board, whether it's the county commissioners, whether it's your local police department. Some of you who live in Carrboro may have seen that, I think sometime in February, there's going to be a public hearing related to the issue of body cams and whether or not, what type of policy, whether or not they should be deployed, and if so, what sorts of protocols or guidance should be used in light of this extremely restrictive and not transparent law that the legislature passed recently related to body cameras. So those are occasions where I as an attorney, I want as many people who are concerned to turn out to these events and to voice their opinions. And so that's another way that we can help citizens be involved and informed on issues of this type. I talked about schools. I mean, there are a lot of issues. We didn't talk too much about school-to-prison pipeline. We didn't talk too much about issues like raise the age and criminalizing children as adults. That's a major issue in this state. And this legislative session, this issue is going to be addressed. So if that's something that you think should happen, you should be communicating with your legislators, your county commissioners, your elected DA who is here in this room this evening. You should let people know that you care. And if you don't know about Raise the Age, give me a call tomorrow and I can send you lots of information and make sure you're properly educated on that issue. So those are just a few comments.
So in reference to Charity's question as well, so I think just to piggyback off of what you were saying, as far as contacting the local elected officials, I think it's really important to build bridges in different subsects of the community, whether that be the small community, the community leaders within just Chapel Hill, as well as students, as well as faculty, and I guess that oftentimes that should go unsaid, but I think there's definitely a culture here on UNC's campus of students just running out and protesting, and oftentimes I think that we believe that we have this idea that we can protest, we'll yell and scream, and everything's okay, and it takes a lot more than that. It takes some talking to the important people, sitting down and having those conversations. And I'm sure everyone in here is rather intelligent to know that. But I think it's about building those bridges throughout the community.
I would add real quick, amplifying and supporting the leadership of directly impacted people in communities. And let me set a little bit of context with my answer. When you look at any successful social movement, those movements were led by the people who were most directly impacted by the boot of oppression. When you think about the civil rights movement, it was all races and creeds involved, but the people who were at the forefront, the people who were at the epicenter of that movement, who were the ones who were drinking from the separate but unequal water fountain. When you look at the Dreamers and the undocumented movement around, immigration reform, that's led by impacted people. When you look at the LGBTQ community and marriage equality, that's led by people who are of the same sex who just want to marry someone they love. Similarly, when we look at this movement, it's going to have to be led by people who suffered under the lash and been put in boxes in tiny little cages, them and their family members, and people who wear the mark of a criminal record. That doesn't mean that other folks who aren't situated that way can't contribute and can't be allies, but those folks have to be at the epicenter of that movement. Otherwise, it's not going to win when you look at any other successful social movement in the history of the world. So amplify the leadership of impacted people and impacted communities. That could be volunteering at a local community-based organization that may be ran by a formerly incarcerated man or woman, and they don't have the capacity to churn out grants, and you are a good writer. That could mean volunteering and doing some of that work. It can take a number of different shapes, but until the capacity of that leadership is built and is strong and robust, we are not going to win.
Take one final question, and then I'll ask you to thank our panelists and give you an opportunity to go up and individually.
Mr. Jordan.
Yes, sir.
Before you do that,
yes.
let me thank you for hosting this event.
Thank you, but it's so incentive. Sharif has been back here running back and forth. He'd be a little upset about the call. So it's the entire staff. Jeff Sebo, who's sitting up in front from the P.A.R.S Center for Ethics, really did a great job of working with us to organize this as well. So we need to make sure that we understand that collective efforts have been very much part of this program. Please.
My name is Yuri. I go to visit people in prison, and they happen to be serving for violent crimes. And sometimes when I hear about argument about the prison reform, a lot of emphasis is put on the people who are not violent criminals. And for some reason, maybe just because I have friends who are serving for violent crimes, I hear, well, those people are not violent, therefore they deserve a different, treatment, better treatment. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that, but also one of those friends had been working on his 4-year degrees while incarcerated, and his hope is to become a lawyer. But recently he heard from someone that some of the state bars might not accept him because of his violent record. If any of you know the answer, I know he wants to know.
So I really appreciate your question, because I think it's one of the more important issues that I think have not been sufficiently addressed as it relates to this whole issue of criminal justice reform. And you're right. The politically expedient and popular discussion is, to focus on non-violent drug offenders, for instance, or white-collar criminals. But if we only do that, then we will barely make a dent in mass incarceration. I mean, and so we need to recognize that violent offenders, people who are convicted of violent crimes in this country, are punished much more severely than offenders in practically any other country in the world. And so even when people have been in prison for decades and no longer are a threat to anyone, we still have a system that keeps them incarcerated. And at some point you have to ask, not only what is the purpose of what is fair, but it becomes counterproductive. And so most sociologists and criminologists and people who study a crime and how to address it say that you get to a point of diminishing return and where you actually make a situation more criminogenic, in other words, likely to produce more crime instead of reducing crime. And when you impose these extremely lengthy sentences unnecessarily, then that's what happens. But these lengthy sentences are what happens when you have a criminal justice system that, it pretty much operates in the political sphere. So people get elected or not elected based upon how, whether or not you have a tough system. And you saw some of that played out in the documentary. So I think you now have more reform advocates beginning to talk about the need to revisit not just our sentencing schemes for non-violent offenders, but also for people who've been convicted of violent crimes. Because the other part of this that needs to be addressed is the horrible conditions that a number of people live in prison, in these prisons. And when you have prison systems with huge numbers of people, you don't have the resources to properly address, to house them and give them what they need. They are human beings. They are citizens. They need to be treated with some level of dignity. Most of them are going to come out. You don't want to have a system that almost ensures that people are going to come out worse than they went in. What does that do? What does that say for public safety? It's nothing. Nothing productive. And so you're right. I mean, I think, and we have these conversations in some of the organizations that I work with where we're talking about criminal justice reform. It hasn't gotten as much traction on the national level, but it really is a necessary step if we are going to no longer be the incarceration nation that we are now.
So in reference to the question, I want to focus more on the aspect of there being two different accommodations based on crime. And I'm a kind of person that likes to look at the grand scope of things. So when you think about the film, just to tie everything back and the system of oppression, you start to think, okay, like why are these people doing these things? Why are these crimes happening? Regardless of if it was petty larceny or, sad to say, oftentimes murder or involuntary manslaughter. You think, well, yeah, that person deserves to have a longer sentence. Yeah, that person deserves to be treated like trash. But at the end of the day, I think what the other two panelists agree is that people are people. And at the end of the day, people deserve a certain level of respect, regardless of what they've done or what they've been through. And so I don't agree with the fact that there should be two different levels of accommodations, depending on the level. I think it just needs to be improved holistically, because you have to understand people's stories, and that allows you, that gives you a gateway into understanding why they did what they did. At the end of the day, once again, we're all people. So just leave it with that.
I'll touch on the bar question since I crossed the character and fitness hurdle in North Carolina and in Minnesota. In many states it's discretionary, and that means that it isn't an automatic exclusion. The Board of Law Examiners gets to decide, and you know, your friend can make their case. And I just know of more and more formerly incarcerated people that are getting barred in different states, so let them know it is possible. With regards to the dichotomy, violent versus nonviolent, you're exactly right, and people in the advocacy community are guilty of it as well as the other bifurcation of people who've committed crimes that require them to register, or what some people call sex offenders. They are oftentimes the third rail of the advocacy community. When the recidivism rate, if you back out serial child predators, right, which is a small fraction of the people who are committed of crimes that require them to register, the recidivism rate is the lowest for those folks. And it's also the lowest when it comes to people who've been convicted of serious violent crimes, partly because we hold them and they age out of criminogenic tendencies. But I think your question also implicates us to really interrogate what keeps us safe and what facilitates public safety. And there is more of a movement to start looking at criminal justice through a public health lens and take into account other socioeconomic indicators of health and wellness. And when you look at advantaged communities and the public safety outcomes that they produce, they look a certain way, right? Lower amounts of robberies, car break-ins, burglaries, rapes, and murders, right? When you look at the milieu of access to opportunity that they have, whether it's good employment opportunities, safe, affordable housing, not living in a place that's infested with environmental toxins, access to green space, I don't live in a food desert. Those are all contributors to the milieu of things that keeps that community safe. Not just police, not just the criminal laws. And what we have to do is to develop the political will to make sure that those opportunity indicators are available to disadvantaged communities as well. If we do, we will see different public safety outcomes from those communities also.
Maurice Greer, Empowerment Incorporated, a nonprofit located here in Chapel Hill. And what I want to ask the three of you all is, the film is very real, but so is the activity that's happening in Chapel Hill. The young men and women that are in this system, of the pictures that we just saw from the movies. My question is, how would we ignite the people that are in this room? Your recommendations on how to have people understand that we need help in Chapel Hill now. It's not just on the campus, but we need it now.
That's a rhetorical question.
I agree with you.
Well, I said that I would allow her to make that statement because she's very interested and also a very strong Stone Center supporter. So as I say, that's a rhetorical question. How do we do this? But before you get up and leave, it's very interesting. Half of the audience is left, but we still got a full audience. So let's use that power to thank our panelists. You're welcome to come up and thank the